The night was heavy with silence. The old plantation house stood like a beast in the dark, its windows glowing with candlelight, its walls echoing the faint laughter of men who believed they owned the world. Inside, the master of the estate, a wealthy man whose name carried fear across the county, raised a silver goblet of wine to his lips. His family dined around him, unaware that this meal would become the last memory they would ever share together. At first it was subtle. The master's hand trembled slightly as he placed the goblet down. He coughed once, then twice, harder this time. The laughter at the table faded. His wife leaned closer, confused. "Are you well?" she whispered. His face flushed red, then drained pale. The veins in his neck tightened like ropes. Within moments he gasped for air, clawing at his throat as if invisible hands were choking him. The children screamed. The candles flickered. Servants rushed in, their eyes wide with fear, but none dared to touch him. Everyone knew the rules. When the master suffered, slaves could only watch. His body convulsed, knocking the chair backward. Silver plates crashed to the floor, meat and bread scattering like discarded offerings. The room reeked of terror. Within minutes, the most powerful man in the county lay dead on the floor, his eyes bulging, his mouth frozen in a final silent cry. But the real story was not his death. The real story was the hand that delivered it, the quiet hand of someone who had been invisible his entire life. Someone born into chains, beaten into obedience, yet patient enough to wait for this night. A slave. The whispers began almost immediately. They say it was poison. They say the wine was tainted. They say a slave killed him. No proof. No evidence. Only suspicion that spread like wildfire across the plantation. Fear gripped the air, not fear for the master's death, but fear of what it meant. If a slave could kill a master, then the entire system of control, the very foundation of slavery, could collapse. The other slaves heard the screams from the big house. In the dark fields they lifted their heads. In the stables they froze, listening, and in their hearts a dangerous thing sparked, a thought they had been forbidden to feel. Hope. But hope was as dangerous as poison. Because in the world of slavery, a master could die, but the system would survive. And when the system suspects rebellion, blood always follows. This is the forgotten story of one act of defiance, buried beneath centuries of silence. A story not written in books, not celebrated in monuments, but whispered in the shadows of history. The story of the slave who poisoned his master. The morning after the master's death, the plantation looked the same from a distance. The sun rose slowly over the endless fields of cotton, painting the horizon gold. The air was thick with dew, and the stalk stood tall like an ocean of white waves. But for those who lived in the shadows of the fields, nothing was the same. Fear hung heavy. Every slave who stepped into the rows that morning carried the weight of suspicion, as if invisible chains had tightened around their throats. To understand this story, you must understand the world they lived in. On a plantation, the master's word was law, sharper than any blade, heavier than any stone. The big house stood tall at the center, with its white pillars and polished wood, a symbol of wealth stolen through blood and sweat. But behind it, in the far distance, stood the slave quarters, small rotting cabins barely fit for animals. That was where lives were born and broken. For a slave, the day began before sunrise. A horn would blow, sharp and merciless, cutting through the morning fog. Men, women, and even children staggered out of their cabins, their backs sore, their bodies scarred from whips that never healed. Breakfast, if it came at all, was a handful of cornmeal or scraps from the master's table. Then came the fields. From dawn until dusk, slaves bent over the earth, fingers bleeding from cotton thorns, muscles burning from the weight of endless work. Overseers on horseback watched them with cold eyes, whips coiled in their hands like snakes ready to strike. A single pause, a glance too long, a word whispered in the wrong ear, any of it could bring the lash across their backs. Some lashes tore skin, some tore spirit, both left scars that lasted a lifetime. For the women, there was no safety. They worked the same fields, carried the same loads, and suffered the same beatings. But at night, when darkness fell and the master's house glowed with candlelight, they lived with another terror. Many were forced into the big house, their bodies treated as property, their cries swallowed by walls that refused to listen. Children were born into this world without choice, without names that belonged to them. They were not sons or daughters, they were stock, lives measured in value like cattle. This was the world of the man who dared to poison his master. He was no stranger to pain. His back carried the story of lashes, each scar a memory carved in flesh. He had seen friends hung from trees for daring to run. He had heard mothers scream as their children were sold at auction, never to be seen again. He had tasted hunger that gnawed at his stomach like a wolf, and he had endured silence that suffocated the spirit. But within him, a fire smoldered. Not all slaves accepted their chains quietly. Some resisted in small ways, working slower, breaking tools, pretending to be sick. These were the silent rebellions, the only weapons they had against a system designed to crush them. Yet there were others who carried heavier dreams. They whispered of escape, of the north, of freedom. Some even whispered of revolt. The master's death changed everything. To the overseers, it was a sign of danger. If a slave could slip poison into the master's cup, what else were they capable of? Their whips struck harder, their eyes watched closer. The entire plantation became a prison under siege, every slave a suspect. To the slaves, it was something different. A rumor, a spark. For years they had been told they were powerless, told they were less than human, told they were destined only to serve. But now, one man's act had cracked that illusion. If a slave could kill a master, then maybe the system wasn't unbreakable after all. Still, hope came at a terrible price. Rumors of rebellion brought swift punishment. The body of any suspected slave might be left hanging from a tree as a warning, his blood soaking into the roots, his death a message to the others. Do not dream. Do not hope. And yet hope lived on. In the quiet of the night, inside the slave cabins, voices whispered. They spoke of courage, of danger, of freedom. They spoke of the poisoner, not with fear but with respect. They did not know his name, and perhaps they never would, but they knew what he represented, a crack in the chains. This was the world in which our story unfolds, a world where a man, stripped of his humanity, dared to strike back in the only way he could. A world where survival meant silence, but dignity demanded defiance. The plantation was not just a place of labor, it was a battlefield of the mind. Masters believed they owned the bodies, but what they feared most was the spirit they could not kill, and on that night when the master's goblet turned into his coffin, that spirit rose higher than ever before. This is not just a story of one death, it is the story of every lash, every scream, every stolen life that led to it. The story of how brutality breeds resistance, and how even the most powerless can find a weapon in the darkest places. Because in the world of slavery, every chain forged rebellion, and every scar whispered a dangerous truth. The oppressed do not forget. Before the whispers of poison, before the night the master fell to the ground gasping for breath, there was a boy born not into life but into chains. His name was whispered only among the slaves, never spoken in the presence of the master. To the master, he was not a name. He was property, a number on a ledger, a line of ink in an account book. But to his mother, he was life itself. She held him in her arms in a wooden cabin with walls so thin the wind cut through them, whispering promises of freedom she knew she could never keep. He grew up surrounded by suffering. He watched his mother's back bleed beneath the lash for working too slowly in the fields, though her hands were raw and cracked from endless picking. He saw his father dragged away in chains one night, sold to another plantation far away. He never saw him again. That was the first time he tasted loss, not the kind of loss that comes from death, but the crueler kind, where someone still lives but is taken away forever. The boy learned early that silence was survival. Speak too loudly and you earned a beating. Ask too many questions and you earned suspicion. But inside his silence he listened. He watched. And slowly he understood the world around him. The master's children played in the fields he worked, their laughter ringing like bells while his own hands bled from pulling weeds. At night they slept on feathered mattresses while he curled up on a dirt floor. When the master's son was taught to read by candlelight, the boy could only watch through the crack of a door, hungry not for bread, but for knowledge. He learned to memorize words by sight, stolen from scraps of newspapers thrown into the trash. That hunger for knowledge became his secret weapon. But knowledge alone was not enough. Pain was his teacher too. He learned the way the overseer's whip cracked, the sound it made before it tore skin. He learned how to hide his anger behind lowered eyes, how to mask hatred with obedience. Most importantly, he learned patience, the kind of patience that only the oppressed